Hello, good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is James Liana, and I am the director of the Democratic Resilience Program here at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C., also called CEPA. Thank you for joining us here today. On September 26th, Germany went to the polls for the first national election since 2005, where Chancellor Merkel was not on the ballot. Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats beat out Armin Laschet's Christian Democrats, with the Greens and the pro-business FDP coming in third and fourth, respectively. The far-right AfD actually lost seats nationally for the first time, though it did win some gains in their east strongholds. Now, just in the past week, we have seen some progress towards formal negotiations for a coalition as the Social Democrats, the Greens, and the FDP concluded their exploratory talks and launched formal negotiations to create a three-party coalition, the first in modern Germany. These are highly structured talks with multiple levels of working groups. The process could go on for a while, potentially months, with the goal being to have a government sworn in place by Christmas. Here with us today to discuss the elections, the election results, the implications, and the coalition negotiations, we have two fantastic panelists. Liana is the program director for international affairs for the Körber-Stiftung, and Michael Werz is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. We are thrilled to have you both here with us today. Now, Liana, Michael, I want to get to the coalition negotiations shortly, because I know there's a lot of interest in people understanding what's happening there. But first, I wanted to get your thoughts on the election. What was your biggest takeaway from the election results? Liana, if you could go first.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to discuss what is closely observed by everyone here in Berlin, how the coalition negotiations are going on. But let me first start with my takeaways of these elections, which have indeed been fundamental elections for Germany after 16 years, the end of the era Merkel. And if we start on a positive note, the most positive result from these elections is probably that in Germany, despite the political polarization that we see worldwide, the political center holds. That was a very strong signal that came out of these elections, that on the one side, the AfD, as already mentioned, James, lost some percentage points. It remains in the parliament with around 10%, but still it has not increased its share against, although some feared it would. Then on the other hand, we have the left party in Germany, which has lost significantly, and just due to some complicated German election law reasons, which I will not explain in detail here, still remain in parliament. So we have a broad political center in Germany that remains very strong. We have a political core which can work together, and we have a political center and voters that have spoken out in favor of a Politik der Mitte, as we would say in German, a policy of the center. I think that's a very positive sign, and also the fact that all parties were willing and able to go into conversations with each other. The negative note, just not to let it appear as too positive, what has happened in Germany on September 26th, is obviously that a transition of power and a loss of power remains a vulnerable moment in democracy, and it remains a vulnerable moment for political parties. And we've seen this particularly with the Christian Democrats in Germany this year. They have been in power for 16 years, and some would claim they didn't have to do a lot to stay in power because Angela Merkel was just so popular. So the point when they realized that they might lose this power position, which they pretty much assumed they will keep, have led to quite some unusual infighting in Berlin politics, which we have not seen for quite a while. And that is something a major party which plays an important role for the stability of the German political party system, not coming to terms at the moment with such an election result, is something which we have to observe in the future and hopefully see this party stabilize in the future.
Thank you. We were going to visit some of those themes in a bit. but I wrote down the line, despite political polarization, the center holds. So I think that is something that is worth thinking about, and especially during this period of political polarization that we've seen all over the world. It's nice. It was very reassuring to see these the center hold here. Michael, I want to ask you the same question. What was your biggest takeaway from the results?
Thank you, James. It's a great pleasure to be on a CIPA panel. Liana, it's fantastic to see you and to talk to you. Look, James, I think there are a handful of major takeaways. Liana is absolutely right when she says the center held. At the same time, it's an ambivalent situation to the degree that if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, the tectonic shifts in German party politics are similar to what we see in the United States, only that here in the US, these developments happen within the two parties because we are tied to a two-party system, whereas in a parliamentarian system, there's a different expression of political differentiation of modern societies because of the multi-party assets that they have. If you look at the early 1980s, Social Democrats and conservatives in Germany, the SPD and the CDU, the two main parties, would represent close to 90% of the vote. Even in the early 2000s, 20 years later, and way after German unification, this was still close to 80%. And right now in this election, 2021, it is less than 50. So this is an interesting change that might not be entirely visible. I think we have similar developments with the internal differentiation of Democrats and Republicans here in the United States. But there is a shift going on in German politics, which I believe is also expressed by the tremendous and fairly atypical volatility that we have seen over the course of the last year. I don't want to go into the numbers too much, but the CDU, the Conservative Party, was polling at one point in December of last year at 36%. Compared to that high point, that party has lost since December of 2020 over 1/3 of its support and came in at the result that we have seen a couple of weeks ago at 24%. In April of 2021, the German Green Party was polling at 25%. And compared to the actual result in September, only a few months later, the Greens lost almost 40% of their support compared to that high point. And needless to say, the Social Democrats, which the party that won the election and came in as the strongest party, albeit by a small margin, was polling at 15% in summer, in June of this year. So this is interesting because voter turnout is still very high in Germany, close to 80%, 76 and something. But the volatility is indicative of the fact that party loyalties and affiliations are not as steady, as steadfast and strong as they used to be. That, I think, relates to one other point that I feel is underreported and also not sufficiently discussed in Germany as far as I can see, and which goes directly to Liana's point that the political center holds. At the same time, if you look at the splinter parties that didn't make the 5% threshold, they represent close to 9% of the vote. And most of these parties are not part of a broader democratic and constitutional spectrum, if you will. And then you have over 10% of voters for the neo-fascist AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, and you probably can count into that authoritarian cohort about half of the voters for the Linkspartei, the post-Stalinist leftist party, which means that if you add these numbers, that one would have to assume that close to 20% of Germans that vote, these are not non-voters, these are people that actually make the effort and vote, are voting outside the constitutional framework. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind when talking about Liana's very strong and legitimate point that the political center, in the census of a post-re-education consensus that still is viable and politically important in Germany for conservatives and social democrats and liberals alike, that at the same time, the fringes are relatively strong, and this is something to be concerned about.
I want to pick up on that point on the volatility, because I think that's really fascinating. I've been watching the polls throughout over the past year, and it is, you said, it was up and down. Where, I mean, in the spring, people thought the Greens might actually win the chancellorship, and then for most of the time, the CDU was on kind of a cruise control. So I guess, to what extent do you think it was due to some of the political missteps that took place. So this sort of scandal or the controversy around plagiarism that occurred, and the unfortunate laughter during the press conference about around the floods, the horrific floods over the summer. That to what point do you think it was those specific moments in the campaign that could have changed versus larger structural issues as you were talking about?
I'm sure that Liana is observing this much more closely than I do, but I would say there are 2 points that are important to recognize. Annalena Baerbock has been a young lead candidate for the German Green Party, and people did not know very much about her because she has not been as omnipresent in political German life as Olaf Scholz, for example, the lead candidate of the Social Democrats. And I feel, and I think also her staff feels, that the fact that she was relatively unknown, she was seen as a fresh face, as a modernizer, as somebody that was attractive in moving Germany forward. And that is why the very, very high polls came in April and May. But at the same time, when people realized that there were inconsistencies in her published CV, that there were copy and paste parts in one of the books that she had published, these things became disproportionately important because people did not know her that well, and she didn't have a long-standing career in politics. So this is interesting also for the US context, that because sometimes you feel that here in the United States, we're only electing people that can actually prove that they have absolutely no previous experience in politics, and that somehow qualifies them, that there's also a certain risk. And for the CDU, for the conservative candidate who had a long time struggle with lackluster support and approval ratings in German public, I think that has overshadowed in the journalistic and public debate a little bit the fact that there is really 2 massive developments that have hurt the Conservative Party in Germany, because they have lost what the party internally calls the 60-plus bastion, the voters that are 60 years and older, basically retired Germans. In that age group, the Social Democrats increased their support by 19%, which is unheard of. That for the first time, Social Democrats in decades are the strongest party among Germans over 60. And at the same time, which meant that the SPD gained over 2 million votes from the conservatives. And also the CDU lost almost 1 million voters because they died. You might say 3 million voters is not that much, but if you look at 45 million voters total that went to the polls, this is almost 77% of the entire voting population. So I think these points are relevant to keep in mind.
Thank you very much. Liana, I want to give you a chance to jump in, but also one other important statistic, I think, is also there were the older voters, but also the younger voters disproportionately went for the FDP and the Greens on the right and left. And so again, there is that generational shift too of that sort of rejection of the big tent and kind of establishment parties. But Liana, I want to give you a chance to respond as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and that underlines what Michael has just said. I think this volatility that we see in German politics, what you mentioned, that the big tent parties are not sort of just gaining all the votes as they have been in the past, or most of the votes. This is a trend that we see all in Europe. So this is a trend which has finally arrived also in Germany. And then also to explain why there has been such volatility in sort of 6 months before the elections, this has basically been the strategy of the Social Democrats all along, because they decided 1 year before the election, they for themselves put out the strategy that they assumed most people in Germany have not realized that Merkel will not be chancellor again. And they were right with this approach. And it's pretty simple, because just a couple of months before the elections, when actually all the election campaigns started, which are very short this year due to the pandemic, only then at some point did the voters realize, oh, if I vote for the CDU, it's not going to be Merkel again. It's really going to be this other guy, this Armin Laschet, who, as you mentioned, made a couple of mistakes. So this was a strategy that the Social Democrats betted on from the beginning, and a strategy they succeeded with, especially as the candidate, Olaf Scholz of the Social Democrats, tried to portray himself in a way which put him basically in line with Angela Merkel. So we all know this famous sign of Angela Merkel standing like that. He used this in the election campaign. And his advantage was to some extent that there was quite some significant political infighting in the Social Democrats 2 years ago. So they already had their fight between the left wing of the party and the right wing of the party. And during the election campaigns, they were able to give quite a strong and united performance in contrast to the Christian Democrats. So here the strategy of the Social Democrats was quite successful. And coming back to the questions, why did the young population vote for the Greens and for the FDP? Two topics were crucial in mobilizing the young generation. The one topic is obviously climate change. Fridays for Future is popular in Germany. It is a very prominent mobilization campaign. The other topic for those that are not as green as the Fridays for Future people is digitalization in Germany. And there, the Liberal Party, the Free Democrats, they actually were able to portray themselves as the party which will make progress in digitalization. Especially the pandemic has shown in Germany to what extent Germany lags behind on digital services. I can tell some catastrophic stories, but I will not do it here. So this was really an incentive for the young generation to look out for other parties that were not in power through two grand coalitions in Germany through the last years. And what I think we will see in the future is definitely a tendency where we will not have the major coalition partner and the junior partner. These times are over. And we've seen this already now. The Greens and the Liberals portrayed themselves as the kingmakers and are able to draw quite some concessions from the Social Democratic Party. So we will see a more diverse field with not one big party and their support junior coalition partner, but with perhaps 30%, 25%, 30 is perhaps too much, 25% party together with 15, 20% parties. That's probably going to be the coalition formats of the future.
And your point about concessions brings me to my next question, which I think, which is about the coalition negotiations. So a lot of people have been skeptical about the so-called traffic light coalition of the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP, in part because they're ideologically quite different, especially on fiscal policy and approaches towards addressing climate change. But the roadmap that they developed over the weekend, that is the guidelines for the formal coalition negotiations, appears to have been a very carefully negotiated, and like you said, there were a lot of concessions made towards the junior partners. The SPD won commitments to raising Germany's minimum wage. The Greens won a suite of environmental measures, including phasing out of coal power, and the FDP was able to prevent any raises in taxes, which is obviously one of their dominant issues. So I'm curious, it seems like this is really working out to be a carefully crafted and negotiated coalition. But I mean, Christian Lindner, the head of the FDP, described it as a marriage of convenience. Is this marriage going to hold? Michael, Liana, please go ahead, and then Michael will go to you after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put exactly the crucial point into the spotlight. This working paper reads a little bit like a shopping list for everyone. So there are a lot of points included for all the voters of the different parties. And what is fascinating is that sort of these coalition attempts are portrayed in the media with a very carefully drafted communication strategy. So all three parties communicate exactly the same, that they represent innovation, that they represent a new age, and to some extent, they even engage in some pathetic wording about a new glitter and a new shine in German politics. So there is really an attempt to portray this as a new coalition which has a lot of ambitions. But due to the constraints that they have in their party programs, taxes versus spending, and I think that's a point where you can find a compromise if you say that investments are crucial for the future and are therefore not taken into account of the debt break. So there will be compromises like this where you can bring the parties together. But to say that this working paper is really ambitious, I think it's too far at the moment. We will have to see what they develop in the coalition talks, but at the moment it has the danger to become a lowest common denominator paper, which would definitely not be a good direction for the future of Germany.
Michael, I want to turn to you with the same question, and also if you can also look for, I think for a lot of our audience is also thinking about what are the kind of key appointments that and positions that are out there. I know both the Greens and the FDP are eyeing up the finance ministry, but what are so in addition to can this marriage of convenience hold? If there are any additional sort of appointments that our viewers should keep an eye on, that'd be really good to know as well.
Sure, and again, I agree with what Liana has just pointed out. It's important to remember that the FDP, which is a center liberal centrist party, which has moved towards the more conservative positions over the last 15 or 20 years, that they received almost 1/5 of their vote in this election from former CDU voters. So from a party perspective, strategically, if you want to strengthen the FDP and maintain a relatively high level of support that they have found in German society after a few years that put the future existence of the party into question, it makes sense that they try to position themselves as a liberal, pro-business center-right party. And that will be, as Liana said, one of the major issues that needs to be negotiated, although it seems that there is a difference between what is being discussed internally among the three parties and the way things are being publicly presented, also to appease, to a certain degree, more conservative members of the FDP. I think it is important, especially for our US context here, because you've spoken about the ideological diversity of the party, to keep in mind that the Democratic Party in the United States represents political positions that start to the left of the Social Democratic Party, cover all social democratic positions, the Green Party, major parts of the Liberal Party, all the way into the moderate conservative spectrum. So I would argue that the coalition is not as, in Germany that is not as diverse or as incompatible as it might seem, just because the political positions are expressed in different political institutions in three different parties. But here in the United States, this is much more complicated, as is being documented by the internal struggles that the Democratic Party is undergoing. It's also important to recognize that since the Reagan era, the political spectrum in the United States has shifted so far to the conservative end of the spectrum that from a European and more specifically German perspective, both the Clinton and the Obama administrations, in terms of their social, fiscal, economic, and not even to speak about security and foreign policy, they were center-right governments for German and European standards. So I think this is important to keep in mind. With regard to the names that are floating around, I think the three parties have done an admirable job so far to keep that discussion out of the public arena, because it is important, as Liana has said, that they figure out the basic pillars of a future coalition agreement. And these coalition agreements are they're not legally binding, but they're politically binding. So these documents have great importance in German politics. As you mentioned, the Greens and the FDP had a semi-public competition about the finance ministry, which started when the Green Party leadership, knowing that they would come in as second largest party in that coalition, were claiming the possibility to staff that finance ministry, because the Greens are completely wedded and also need to deliver for their constituency the environmental and sustainable transformation of the German economy. And the experience over the last few governments, with first a conservative finance minister by the name of Wolfgang Schäuble, and then an almost equally conservative finance minister by the name of Olaf Scholz, although he was nominally a social democrat, both very unwilling to do deficit spending at the necessary scale in order to move the transformation of the German economy, which, as you know, has resource scarcity, is export dependent and high-tech dependent. To move the German economy into a more sustainable direction, that is a generational challenge that will require massive amounts of money. So the Greens were kind of anticipating that and claiming the possible finance ministry for themselves and for their party to make sure that sufficient funding would be available for what they call the future transformation of German society. It's still too early. There is talk about a climate ministry that might be set up as a new department. There might be other changes. There's anywhere between 14 and 15 ministries to be had. And obviously in a three-party coalition, it will depend not only on gender, but also on inner party regional considerations. And then ultimately, we might not have been used to that, especially during the Trump administration. It also depends on whether politicians are actually qualified to run these departments. So there might be some surprises in the box still for us, depending on how that party arithmetic works out and plays out in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Excellent, thank you. I want to save some time to talk about foreign policy as well. I know it wasn't the defining issue in the election, but I feel like there was a more robust foreign policy debate during the German campaign than we've typically seen. In part, the Greens, I think, really drove a very, calling for very vocally for a new approach to Germany's role in the world. And I think the FDP was in a similar position too, advocating a very similar kind of more involved role in the world. And there are no shortage of foreign policy issues to deal with today. So I guess my biggest question, though, is, do you think, given the role of the Greens and the FDP, do you think we can anticipate any sort of shift in Germany's approach to Europe, Germany's approach to the world, and how we're dealing with Russia and China? And generally speaking, as the kind of the Merkel held the leadership role, not just in Germany, but also in Europe. And that was due to a number of things: her personal presence, her longevity on the scene, Germany's role in Europe, of course. Do you think we're going to be seeing Olaf Scholz taking on a similar role? Liana, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and it also adds to the question of ministries and responsibilities in Germany, because one of the ministries that is a little bit underestimated or not enough discussed is the Ministry of Defense, who will lead and who will take the Ministry of Defense. And I think that's an important point, because the security policy of the new coalition is something which, from a US perspective, should be very closely observed, because we have, as parties, we have the Green Party, which have moved towards the middle in their foreign policy positions, but still supports, in principle, a withdrawal of US nuclear weapons from Germany, although of course, only with considerations by NATO members. So the Greens come from a pacifist tradition, and they have moved to the middle. At the same time, we have the Social Democrats, which in recent years have moved rather towards the left on security policy. So I think this is an important space to watch for the future, and especially also for security policy in the transatlantic relationship, who will get this ministry and what kind of course the traffic light coalition will take on these issues. And then on the question of general change or continuity in German foreign policy, we actually did a polling just before with our Berlin Pulse annual surveys that we do at Körber Foundation in July this year, where we asked the German public whether they are concerned that Germany will lose its standing in the world after the departure of Angela Merkel. And the result was that the majority of Germans were not afraid of that. So this sort of belief in the structural power of Germany in Europe and the world. And at the same time, most Germans, or the majority of those asked, saw Olaf Scholz as the candidate with the most expertise on foreign policy issues, which is surprising because Annalena Baerbock is actually the person who has worked much more on foreign policy, but she received the lowest result. So if we look at this, and if we also look at past polling numbers, the German public is very cautious when it comes to change in German foreign policy. They usually opt for restraint rather than more international engagement. But two areas where we will definitely see some changes is Russia and China policy, because we do have the Greens with a very normative stance, and also the Free Democrats, where Christian Lindner just recently gave a speech, a prominent speech, in honor of Alexei Navalny. So I think we will see in rhetoric a stronger stance on Russia and especially on China, as Merkel has received a lot of criticism for her pragmatic China stance. But it might probably not go as far as some in Washington would wish. And the question then is, how do you back up your rhetoric with instruments, especially if we look at the security policy, the current positions in security policy of some of the parties.
Excellent. Thank you. Michael, I don't know if you want to jump in on foreign policy. We're getting close to time, so I'm going to ask the panelists also to think about any final, anything we didn't get to cover that we want to address here. But Michael, foreign policy.
Yeah, so I think I would preface this by maybe pouring a drop of tar into the barrel of honey when it comes to Angela Merkel and her foreign policy leadership. I think there were quite a few situations where she could have done more. To give you just two examples, when Macron gave his big Europe speech a few years back, as complicated as the German-French relationship was at the point in time, it was, I thought, negligent not to take the French up on a unified, stronger position towards EU conversations between Germany and France, especially with the Brits running away from the European Union. I think that is one of the larger failures of the Chancellery, not to be more engaged in this arena. I think secondly, if Angela Merkel was somewhat more of a public speaker that could inspire people, Obama style, if she had been capable of backing up her brave and correct position in 2015 when the refugees from Syria and other places were piling up at the German border, and she said, we can do this, and had people come to Germany. If she had been able to solidify this with a Marshall Plan style speech and say, this is good for German society, this is where we're going to be in 10 years, this is going to be a success story, I think you would have a different situation domestically in Germany and possibly in Europe when it comes to refugees, migration issues, and others that are so divisive right now in the European context. I would agree again with Liana that Greens and FDP have positioned themselves much more strongly when it comes to human rights issues. It's always easier to do this when you're in the opposition than when you have to talk to people that say there are 850,000 German jobs reliant on car production, and China is the biggest market for Volkswagen. So where do you want to go with this? I would certainly hope that at least when it comes to domestic inner European and inner German interference, especially by Russia and by Turkey, the Russians assassinating dissidents all across Europe, and the Turks having several hundred Secret Service agents active in Germany, harassing and suppressing Turkish opposition figures, German Turks in the country. I think that there's a fair expectation that they will be much stronger on these issues. In the terms of the transatlantic relationship, it's really interesting how this will play out, because there was, for the first time, I think, in recent German politics, a competition between CDU, SPD, Conservatives, Social Democrats, and the Green Party, who was the most pro-transatlantic candidate. It's interesting to see how this is going to be spelled out. Important to remember, foreign policy, to the degree that I could tell from the distance here in the United States, didn't really play a significant role in the electoral campaign. And if you look at the first paper of the three parties that Liana has mentioned, the paper has 12 pages, and foreign policy is the last bullet point that starts on page 11. So it doesn't seem to have an overwhelming relevance for the negotiations that are going on. As in the United States, most of the issues are domestic, and there's a worrying inward orientation in almost all Western societies right now.
Well, I thank you for that, Michael. That's fantastic. Liana, thank you so much. We are at time, unfortunately, but this was a fantastic conversation. We covered foreign policy, coalition negotiations, and everything in between with the election. So I really just want to say thank you both, Michael and Liana, for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I'll see everyone.